Good morning, everyone. It's Rabbi Akiva Males. Today is Friday. It's September 4th. We're getting ready for Parshas Savo. I want to share with you a Dvar Torah this week, something that I saw, and it made a big impression on me. I think it's also very relevant to the time in which we're living. I saw a fascinating comment, a fascinating idea from the Chida. The Chida, as we know, is an acronym for Reb Chaim Yosef David Azulai. It's a big name, Reb Chaim Yosef David Azulai. He was one of the great Gaonim, one of our great Talmidei Chacham and real Torah sage, came from the Sephardic world, was born in Eretz Yisrael in Israel, and he thrived in the 1700s. Absolutely fascinating personality, and he was a prolific author. He wrote an incredible number of Sfarim. And this week, I learned of a sefer that he wrote with Perushim and Chumash that I hadn't heard of before. It's called Chomas Anach. Chomas Anach. Here's a title page of it, Reb Chaim Yosef David Azulai. And he has an absolutely fascinating comment on this week's Parsha. Let me share it with you. So Parshas Savo begins with the mitzvah of Bikurim. And that's when farmers in Israel would bring the first fruits of their fields. They'd bring it to the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. And they would have this elaborate ceremony in which they would present it to the Kohanim. And when they would present it to the Kohanim, they also would recite a whole formula explaining what they had done and how HaKadosh Baruch Hu had really a brief synopsis of Jewish history, where we began, where we've gone, and where we're going to. And you'll notice as you read it, much of this is in the Pesach Haggadah. You'll recognize it from Leil HaSeder, from what we recite every Pesach at the Pesach Seder. But here's what the Chida has to comment. He brings down in the first psukim a question that an earlier sage, someone earlier than the Chida, asked. And let me read the psukim. The psukim are as follows. Vayaki Savo al Aretz. And it'll be when you come into the land, Asher Hashem Elokecha nosen lecha nachala. That's the land that the Lord your God is giving to you as an inheritance. Yirishta v'yishavte ba. You will possess it and you'll settle in it. Pasuk Beis. L'kachta mereshis kol priya adama. And then you will take the first of all the fruit of the ground, priya adama. So the Chida brings down that one of the Gaonim of a previous generation asked the following question. He says, why does it call it priya adama? It should be called priya eitz, because the whole mitzvah of Bikurim is limited to the Shiva Minim, the 7 fruits that are unique to the land of Israel. Those aren't priya adama. Those should be labeled as priya eitz. So why are we calling it priya adama? He says an earlier Gaon, as he refers to him, asked this question and offers a couple of answers. Seems like a good question. I never thought of it, never noticed it before. Why is it the Torah referring to it as lakachta mereshis kol priya adama? These aren't vegetables. These are priya eitz. We should be referring to them as fruits. So the Chida mentions the question, and he says that the one who asked this question offered several reasons. And then the Chida goes on to explain why he doesn't think any of the reasons offered are good answers. He doesn't like any of them. He feels they're dochek, they're forced, they're not good. And then the Chida says, I have my own answer to this question. It's very simple, but it's also very profound. And here's what the Chida answers. He says, you're right. If you're just looking at this one pasuk, then you've got a question. But you know what you've got to do? You've got to fast forward. Go several psukim further. Look at pasuk Yud. When we read about the speech or the formula that the farmer says when he presents the Bikurim, presents these first fruits to the Kohen, look at what he says in pasuk Yud. So here's the pasuk. The verse says, "Va'ata," and now hinei vesi es reishis kol priya adama. I brought all the first of the fruit of the ground, but the pasuk doesn't end calling it priya adama. It's connected as follows: "Va'ata hinei vesi es reishis priya adama." I'm bringing all the fruits of the ground. Asher nasata li Hashem. This is the adama. This is the ground that God has given us. Part and parcel of this speech. The reason why in pasuk Yud it's called priya adama, you can't call it priya eitz. Because we're saying priya adama asher nasata li Hashem. We're thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the matana, for this great gift he gave us, matnas Eretz Yisrael, that he gave us the land of Israel. And that's the context. Because in pasuk Yud, we're saying it's priya adama asher nasata li Hashem. This is the fruit of the land which God gave to me, fruit of the earth which God gave to me. So we want to be consistent. Since in pasuk Yud it's calling it priya adama asher nasata li Hashem, this is the fruit of the land that God gave to me. That's why back in Pasuk Beis, when it's referring to Bikurim, It says Priyadama. It never's talking about vegetables. It's talking about the Priyadama that I'm going to reference in Pasuk Yud. If I see Pasuk Yud, I could go a little further and see Pasuk Yud, then Pasuk Beis makes sense. That's what the Chidah is saying. You have to see it in its context. And there are times that if we only see what comes later, we see the following psukim, we see the following words, then we're able to make sense for what may have seemed enigmatic originally. I saw this idea from the Chidah and I said to myself, it's a beautiful idea. I love what he did here. He took a question that a previous scholar had asked. The answers that scholar offered didn't sit well with him. And he says there's a simple resolution to this question. You just have to look a little further. Look a little weiter and you'll see what the Pasuk says in Yud. And now that helps us understand what had occurred earlier in Pasuk Beis. And then as I thought about this, as I really stewed over this idea of the Chidah this week, it hit me is that this is such a message for the time that we're living in nowadays. What's the real message of this Chidah? The Chidah says you have to see the later psukim. If we want to make sense of the current psukim, if we want to make sense of Pasuk Beis, we have to see Pasuk Yud. We can't just be looking at Pasuk Beis and expect to make sense of everything. We have to take a step back. We have to see the larger picture, be able to put it into context. And yes, when we see Yud, then Beis could fall into place. We can't possibly hope to make sense of everything we're going through now. We're living through such a challenging time right now. This is such an enigmatic time. We don't know what Hashem wants from us. We don't know why we're being forced to go through this. As confusing as this was over the last couple of weeks and months, now with the Yom Tovim ahead of us, oh my gosh, the cheshbonos we have to make. Oh my gosh, this is so challenging. And we're not the only ones dealing with this. All of Klal Yisrael is dealing with this idea of how do we accommodate the current situation with what halacha wants from us, what the Torah wants from us. We're racking our brains over this. It's so challenging. And we can't help but ask, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how does this make sense? What do you want from us? Why are we going through all this? But we have to realize we're now at Pasuk Beis. Maybe we're at Gimel because this started 5 months ago, 6 months ago. Maybe we're at Gimel. We're definitely not up to Pasuk Yud. How could we hope to possibly understand and see this in its full context and in the greater picture of things? We're at Pasuk Beis and Gimel now. We're not anywhere near Pasuk Yud. But what keeps us sane is that we understand that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a plan. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a master plan. Somehow or another, this can be put into context. He can make sense of this. And somehow or another, we know that there is a Pasuk Yud. We'll get there one day. And Hashem will enable us to understand what's going on and how this somehow fits with his master plan. But right now, at Pasuk Beis, to think and to have the chutzpah to think that we understand this, that's preposterous. The Navi Yeshayahu tells us, and we read this in Haftarah every single time it's Tzibor. We say, Ki lo machshavosai machshavosechem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us that the way I think, my cheshbonos, my calculations, they're so distant from human calculations. Ki gavu shamayim me'aretz, the distance that separates heaven and earth, ken gavu, that's the distance that separates machshavosai and machshavosechem. My cheshbonos, my calculations, the way I think from the way mortal human beings think. It's preposterous for us to think that we can make sense and understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ways right now. Come on, that's impossible. We don't have a Navi who can tell us this. And we're human beings. Ki gavu shamayim v'aretz, the distance that separates heaven and earth, that's the difference between what we can comprehend and what HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what God's cheshbonos, what his calculations are. And we shouldn't rack our heads saying, I can't make sense of this. It makes sense that we can't make sense of this. We're human beings, and we're experiencing something which only God has a full understanding of at this point. But what keeps us sane, and what can give us a coping mechanism during this extremely challenging times that we're living through? I think we have to fall back on what our ancestors have used for millennia, and that is that famous bracha that unfortunately we hear people recite upon hearing the news of the loss of a very close loved one. They say, Baruch Dayan HaEmes. They're benching. They're saying, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you are blessed because we believe you are the true judge. We're experiencing a horrendous loss. We're experiencing our world has been turned upside down. It's been torn to pieces. But what keeps us sane is knowing there's a Dayan HaEmes. There's a true judge. What's occurring in our world isn't happening haphazardly. Somehow or another, it's part of God's master plan. We have no idea how. We're mortal human beings. We can't possibly comprehend that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's running of our world. But what keeps us sane is understanding and recognizing, acknowledging the fact that there's a Dayan HaEmes. there is a true judge. And although this makes no sense to us, although this seems chaotic to us, we understand that in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's cheshbonos, everything falls into place. And we don't know how, but we know that he understands. And he's orchestrating all of this. And one day, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will help us all to understand how everything that went on in our world, as chaotic as it may seem, somehow or another was part of his master plan on what was needed for the world, for Klal Yisrael, for our families, and for ourselves. But let's remember, we're only at Pasuk Beis now. We're not at Pasuk Yud. We're not at that point where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is explaining to us. We daven every day that the Geula should come. The final redemption should arrive. And at that point, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will explain to us how all the sorrows, how all the challenges that we've experienced over these last number of months, and that unfortunately we continue to experience, how somehow or another this fits with his plan. But right now we don't understand it. But what's keeping us sane is knowing is that there is a Dayan HaEmes, there is a true judge behind all of this. This is not chaos. We're not living through a period of tov vavo, a period where there's absolutely no order. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is still in our world. He didn't just create it and walk away. He's actively involved. He's behind the scenes. And somehow or another, all that we're experiencing is part of his master plan. I think this message from the Chidah, the way he answers this question, has such a relevant message to each and every one of us and provides us with a coping mechanism to make it through these extremely challenging times and to maintain a semblance of our sanity. Remember, we're at Pasuk Beis. The answer to all this, how do we understand this, is in Pasuk Yud. God willing, we'll get there soon. Have a good Shabbos, everyone.